Okay, so hopefully that is recording. All right, can you see my presentation, and then we'll get going? Yeah,
yes.
Brilliant. Okay, great. Well, thank you all for coming along. Really pleased to see so many of you able to make it today and to give us a bit of time to talk about climate change and the effects on sport and the potential effects of sport on climate change. I should probably add in that it's physical activity for Get Berkshire Active as much as it is about climate effects on just sport. It's about both things. So for us, we are much wider than the sport agenda, but that's part of what we do. So I'm Nick Westorum. I'm Director of Operations and Development at GBA. And alongside me is Peter Moore, who I'll allow to introduce himself. So over to you, Peter, for a second.
Hi everyone, I'm Peter Moore. I'm Head of Climate Strategy at Reading Borough Council.
Welcome, thank you. So Peter's sort of co-hosting, has been doing several of these sort of events over the week with the festival underway, and kindly helped to offer the climate sort of expertise to my my sort of sports side of things. Okay, so in today's discussion, we'll be looking at the effect of climate change on sport and on physical activity, and vice versa, how the sector might be able to support some of those effects and mitigate perhaps some of those effects. But really, this is an opportunity to explore where our sector is at in Berkshire, in Reading particularly, how we kind of all view or feel about climate change, and to understand how much we feel as a sector we can or should be doing, and potentially how much you're already seeing the climate affecting what you do as organizations. So that's kind of what the event is about. It's more exploratory than anything. We may not get to a final point of concrete actions by the end of this session, but it might be the start of future sessions where we come back together perhaps, and those who are willing and interested start to look at what kind of a future plan might be. Okay, so in terms of housekeeping for the event, please use the kind of usual functions. So you should have a hand function if you want to ask a question, or just come off of mute. We're quite a small group, so come off of mute if you want to jump in and ask a question. We can be fairly informal with that. Likewise, put any questions in the chat and we'll round them up at the end of any of the sort of presentation elements. Otherwise, that's all we need to kind of give you on housekeeping. I think we'll aim to finish before 1 o'clock, depends how much discussion and conversation we get into. And the first part is a little bit of background about what the kind of climate change agenda is, how it affects sport, and the kind of view from Get Berkshire Active. But then we'll go into hopefully most of the session being about a wider discussion with all of you. Okay, so before we do that, it'd be really good to understand who's in the room. So if I can just go around the group and just ask you to say a little bit about who you are, your organization, your role, and then just a sort of 1 to 10 on how much knowledge you have about climate change. So 1 being that you've only literally just heard of it, you don't know anything about it, and a 10 being you're a bit of an expert and you've studied it for a few years. So sort of let us know where you feel you are and your expertise. I would like to say thank you to Reading Football Club and to Reading Rugby Club and to GLL before we start for coming on board and agreeing to kind of be here and to discuss a little bit about your views of the effects and the implications of climate change on your sports. Okay, so if we go around the room, Peter, I'll start with you as kind of co-host.
Yeah, I've introduced myself, but there are some new arrivals. I'll do it again. Peter Moore, Head of Climate Strategy at Reading Borough Council. So we're the unitary local authority for the Reading area. My role was created in 2019, shortly after the council declared a climate emergency. Initially a 2-year contract. Couldn't fix it in 2 years, it turns out. So now a permanent member of staff. And I would say my climate change knowledge, modesty prevents me from saying any more than 7.5, because there's an awful lot to learn and you can't know it all. But I read a lot and do my best.
Great, thank you, Peter. I should probably say my knowledge, I suppose. So I studied a little bit of environmental science at school back when it was called the greenhouse effect. So had a bit of background there at A level. Always had an interest in this area. So I guess my knowledge is probably about maybe a 5 or a 6, but certainly no expert. Who would like to go next? Ellie, you're sort of next on my screen.
Yeah, hi. I'm Ellie. I'm the governance lead for Reading Football Club Community Trust. So we're the charity attached to the football club. So we run sort of after school clubs, development centres, soccer schools in the school holidays, and we also do go into schools and do a bit of PSHE, and we have an alternative provision as well and do some education with Reading College. In terms of our sort of environmental sustainability journey, we're probably right at the start. We are held accountable to this thing called our Capability Code of Practice. And one of the new sections within it is environmental sustainability. So we had to provide some evidence of what we're doing around that. So we've recently just done an impact review and an action plan, and have been working with the football club to create a joint policy and see if our action plans can overlap. My environmental sustainability knowledge is probably a 2 or a 3, not, I'll be a generous 3, I'll say. But yeah, that's what we're doing at the moment.
Great, thanks, Ellie. That's really good. I'll go to the main kind of organisations who agreed to come along and say a little bit first. So, Stuart, would you like to go next?
Okay, I'm Stuart Spindler from Reading Rugby Club. My role is chairman. Sometimes that confuses people a bit. In many ways, it should be called something more like general manager or something similar, because we have a president who does the kind of representational stuff. Mine's more operational and leadership of the club's activities. We're based out on the edge of Sonning. We own our own ground, 3 rugby pitches, all grass pitches. And we are a busy operation with everything from under 6s to walking rugby 70-year-olds and everything in between. In terms of climate change knowledge, that's always how much do you put yourself, where do you put yourself? But I would say probably a 6. I'm a geography graduate by background, long time ago. I'm interested in meteorology, and I've read a fair bit about climate change, so I guess a 6 is reasonable.
Brilliant. Thanks, Stuart. Craig, can I come to you?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Good morning, everybody. Hope you're all well. My name's Craig Woodward, Partnership Manager for GLL, or Better. For those that you don't know, GLL operate the 4 leisure facilities in Reading, so Rivermead, Meadway, South Reading and Palmer Park. Obviously, climate change, energy environment as a whole is huge at the moment, particularly operating facilities, the rise in energy cost as well. So there's further added pressures onto this too. We've got some large targets. We have a team set up out of our head office as well, who's sort of dedicated to an energy environment strategy, and we have targets within our contracts. From a personal perspective, my knowledge is quite low. I'd probably put myself similar to what Ellie mentioned, around the 2 or the 3 mark. However, we do have people within the organisation with far more knowledge than myself. Unfortunately, they couldn't make the call today.
Great, thanks, Craig. That's great in some ways, because we'll get the operational view and kind of understand how it's filtering down from the people who do understand much more. Okay, so next, can I go to Russell, who I probably owe a bit of a thanks to. We met on a training course a while back, so the reason I've got a little bit of knowledge to be able to sit here and do this was from attending one of your courses, Russell. So welcome.
Nick, I was trying to place where we'd met, so thank you for that reminder. My name is Russell Seymour. I'm Chief Executive of an organisation called BASIS, which stands for the British Association for Sustainable Sport. We've been going around 11 or 12 years or so. It came from my own background's in ecology and environmental sciences, and I was working at Lord's Cricket Ground. And I started to look at the impacts that holding events for 30-odd thousand people was having. Took a report to the chief exec, who said it's important, and I believe I was the first sustainability manager at a major UK sports venue. So I was a sustainability manager at Lord's for 11 years, set up BASIS and took it on full time at the end of 2019. In terms of activity in Berkshire, I was the head coach of the Reading University American football team, and I helped create and was head coach of the Berkshire Renegades American football team, which did used to play at Reading Rugby Club, but that was many, many years ago, probably 15 or so years ago, I'd imagine. Desperately want to get in contact with Reading Football Club as well. Been trying to nudge you to become members for a while, so maybe that could be a positive coming out of this one. But yeah, we interact with sports across the UK around this area. Been active in setting up the SEC group, the Sport, Environment and Climate Coalition, involving Sport England, UK Sport, etc., and UK Active, of course. So sorry, bit of a long introduction. So we'll hand back at that point.
Thanks, Russell. Your knowledge is probably somewhere up about the sort of 9-10 stage, I suspect.
I was going to be slightly more modest because sorry, I forgot that bit. I was going to put me in at maybe a 7 or 8 because there's always so much more that you can learn from anybody in this area. And a huge part of it is just having a passion to address this. It doesn't necessarily have to be that technical knowledge as well. Sure.
Okay, thanks, Russell. And Chris, I think we may have met before on previous call. Can I come to you?
Good day, Nick. I thought the name sounded familiar. I was trying to remember where. Yeah, so I'm the chair of BASIS. I'm come from a sort of recreational sport background. I worked at the ECB for a long time, and actually did a lot of the playing pitch strategies for Reading and the different areas. So that gave me a really good insight into kind of the sporting landscape in Reading, because that obviously covers all the pitch sports. And certainly in terms of the sustainable or the sustainability of the growth of sport in Reading wasn't really factored in at that point. So, you know, when the climate emergency was declared, that's obviously going to have quite an impact on those playing pitch strategies going forward. I'm no longer at the ECB, so I'm not involved in that side of it. Climate knowledge, I would say probably about 7, and I tend to be more specialized in some areas than in others. So certainly on the science, but that's what Russ, you know, I can always defer to him. I'm perhaps more on the kind of implementation side, if you like. So that's me.
Great, thank you, Chris. Can I go across to, I think Mark is next on my screen, Mark Lyford. Mark, are you with us? Issues with the mute, perhaps? Okay, we'll come back to Mark. Bob, you able to?
Yeah, sure. My name's Bob Pritchard. I'm an interloper from across the border in Surrey. I work for Active Surrey, where I'm the Marcoms lead. But I also have, I foolishly mentioned to our director that I kind of had an interest in environmental matters. And the next thing I know, I'm kind of writing our environmental and social governance strategy, which incorporates some of the BASIS principles. So thank you to Russell and Christopher for providing some of that input. Incidentally, apologies because I can only do the first hour of the call, so I'll be dashing off about 12. In terms of climate change knowledge, before I heard Russell and Christopher speak, I would have probably put myself at about a 5. Having heard where they place themselves, I'm probably a 2 now, but yeah, certainly personally interested and have some knowledge.
Great, thanks, Bob. Yeah, and I'm reassessing where I'm probably at, given what Russell and Chris said as well. Okay, so I think that's everybody, unless Mark, you're able to come off of mute.
Yeah, Mark just dropped a message in to say that he can't, but he's put his job role in the chat. And I think someone else just joined us. Karen maybe recently joined.
I admitted Karen, but she isn't showing it, or they're not on the list. So I don't know whether they're left. Karen, are you with us? It's one thing about online meetings. If somebody's in the room in face-to-face meetings, you know they're there. Okay, so I think we'll move on then. So thank you all for your intros. That's really useful to know who's in the room. My role, I should probably say, at Get Back Attractive is not around climate change. This is a kind of add-on to my day job, and my role is really around kind of looking after a lot of the operational stuff, but also our development functions with kind of new relationships and looking at how we do our systems change work as well. Okay, so moving on to just a little bit of background about us. Get Berkshire Active, for those of you who don't know us, is an active partnership. We're part of a national network, and we really only exist because Sport England needed a national network of local organisations to help them to land their investments and their strategies in each of the counties in England. And our vision, so as an independent charity, we have a separate vision to Sport England and to other partners, and that is to have inspired people and communities creating a happier, healthier and more resilient Berkshire. And when you sort of look at the words in there, they resonate and overlap really well with a lot of the kind of climate agenda and lots of the objectives that partners in the climate space are trying to achieve. So we're quite closely aligned. We look after a kind of physical activity strategy for the county, and that's about encouraging people to be more active. And that leads us to work with the most disadvantaged groups, which you can kind of see in that diagram to the right. The areas of need is the groups that we're working with, because they are likely to be the most excluded, therefore the least active, and those who need the most help. And it is, as I've said, more about physical activity than sport, but sport is part of the picture. And we also are trying to tackle the much bigger social issues and health issues through sport. So we're not just about getting active, sporty people more active. It is about tackling wider issues like crime prevention, social isolation, employability, lots of other areas, but using sport as the tool. And the kind of climate change agenda is one of those much bigger issues that we feel we have a place in trying to support as much as we can. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to Peter, who's going to give us a little bit of background from the climate side. Can you take control, Peter?
I can take control. I can indeed. Well, I shall attempt to.
Okay, it's given it to you, I think, from the message on my screen. Yours.
Right, there you go. That looks like I'm in control. Right, so welcome everyone. Title of the session is "How can sport help and will it be effective?" And I'll try and address those questions in my presentation. But first, perhaps let's do climate change 101. Some of you won't need this because I'm thinking now I should revise my 7.5 down to lower than our colleagues from BASIS, who sound like they know all this stuff probably better than me. But I won't embarrass myself by trying to explain the greenhouse effect. Suffice to say, what we know from the globally accepted scientific consensus is that climate change is happening, and it's happening quite quickly. We know that human activity is the cause. We know that the generally accepted threshold at which the sort of rise in average global temperature is considered safe is about 1.5 degrees. And we're currently pushing up against that. Various estimates between 1.1 and 1.3 degrees. So we're heading into that territory where the sort of thresholds are starting to get uncomfortably close. And we also know that if we carry on as we are, we could end up with something like a 4-degree rise in temperature by 2100. And 4 degrees means fundamental change to life on Earth with drastic consequences. And those are not the words of hysterical environmentalists. Those are the words of the Met Office. So that's the weather forecast for 2100, and it's a little bit scary. You've already seen this graphic, which Nick flashed up at his presentation. We have the great benefit in Reading of having one of the world's leading collections of climate scientists on our doorstep at the University of Reading, leading in the UK, second in the world for climate science. And there's a lovely chap who, any of you who've seen the publicity around the Hoops for the Future campaign with Reading FC might be familiar with Professor Ed Hawkins. Who's a fantastic communicator, and his expertise is in communicating climate science and engaging the wider public in climate science. And he does that by creating these really clever and simple graphics that illustrate the reality of climate change. One of which is this climate stripes image, which shows the progression in average temperatures for Berkshire over the last 150 years, with blue being the colder years and red being the warmer ones, which shows very eloquently that climate change is real, and we're seeing that happening as we speak. We're in a place, not just because of the university, but because of the efforts of various partners that's recognised for being leaders in climate action. So there's an international NGO called the Carbon Disclosure Project, who cities and corporations can disclose their climate data to and tell them what we're doing about it. And they do an assessment process. We entered our data for Reading last year for the first time, and we're delighted to be put on there, what they call their A list for cities taking bold climate action, which is an accolade they reserve for only 11 other UK cities and 95 worldwide, over 1,000 who report via their platform. So, you know, we took that as some kind of comfort that we must be doing something right, and we want everybody in Reading to be part of and to share in that success. A little bit of sort of geeky jargon from my world that I just think it's worth sharing with you all, just to sort of contextualize some of the things I'll go on to say. Two sides of the sort of climate policy coin, if you like, which you could think of quite simply as one about causes and one about consequences, though they overlap. So causes, the things that driving climate change, the greenhouse gas emissions that we're all putting up into the atmosphere, whether that's from our cars or our buildings or whatever. And all the action we're taking to reduce those is known as mitigation. So that's reducing the things that are causing climate change to happen. Then on the right hand side, we've got obviously the impacts of climate change, which I'll come on to say a bit more about. But anything we do to respond to those impacts, we call adaptation. So, you know, doing things to improve our resilience to flood risk, for example, would be an adaptation to the impact that's happening. And there's a little bit of overlap between those two circles, where there are some things you can do which address both agendas. And the classic example is tree planting. Has a positive impact in absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, therefore reducing the causes of climate change, but can also help us adapt to, for instance, flood risk. By the roots of trees will act as fairly effective sponges, helping to soak up excess water where it otherwise might be a problem for flooding. So try and keep those two sort of agendas in mind as we progress through the discussion today, and they're very neatly reflected in Nick's title for this session about, you know, what can sport do to help, but also how is sport affected by climate impacts. A little bit about the climate sort of policy commitments that we've developed and signed up to in Reading as a local authority and as a community, and they're summarised really in came to a head really in 2019 when the council joined the movement of many local authorities around the country who declared a climate emergency, recognising the urgency and the seriousness of the situation we face with climate change, and made the very bold and ambitious commitment to achieve a net zero Reading by 2030, which means we intend to be putting out no more emissions in 2030 than we can absorb through other means. Well, that was great. We all patted ourselves on the back and you know, thought that was you know, we were radical for doing that, but of course you need a plan then to make it meaningful. So we worked with the partners to develop something called the Reading Climate Emergency Strategy, which was adopted by the council and other partners in November 2020. And that was developed under the wing of a body called the Reading Climate Change Partnership, which brings together all the sort of key sectors and key stakeholders across Reading to share in that commitment. And for the council's part, we also adopted a carbon plan for our own organisation, which committed to similarly ambitious targets and adopted that at the same time. And the link there just gives you a reference to those should you need to look at them for further reading. A little bit about how we're doing. This is the graph for Reading's area emissions as measured by a national statistical data set, which is imperfect, but probably the best we have to show the trajectory for where emissions are heading in Reading. And, you know, pretty positive picture. Reading's emissions have been cut by about 55% since 2005, when that data set began. And that is the fourth largest reduction out of 374 local authority areas in the UK. So, you know, we're doing something right. A lot of that is to do with decarbonisation of the national grid. So the more onshore wind and solar that comes on stream onto the grid, and the more we electrify our economy in Reading, the more that's reflected in these statistics. But it also reflects improvements in transport and other areas which are shown there. So kind of heading in the right direction, but really need to pick up the pace if we're going to meet that 2030 objective. Really important for us as the council, we think, to try and lead by example. You know, we're asking everybody to play their part in responding to climate change, so it's important that we do our bit. And this is the graph for what's happening with Reading Borough Council's emissions. So we've clocked up an almost 70% cut in our emissions since we started measuring that in 2008-9. And that's through, good old-fashioned investment in energy efficiency, bit of asset rationalisation to get rid of buildings and assets that we don't need, and increasingly, as we look ahead to meeting our future targets, electrifying our vehicle fleet and also the heating sources for our buildings. That's what will make the difference and help us keep us on that what's currently a pretty positive trajectory. So turning to the questions then in Nick's opening title. Will sport be effective? Well, undoubtedly, yes. The headlines that we can expect are hotter, drier summers, warmer, wetter winters, and more extreme weather events. And I've got a few examples from further afield that just illustrate that. And you can probably relate these kind of impacts to some of the things that we might be thinking at locally, except perhaps the first one where, we've never had a Winter Olympics, have we? I don't think. But an interesting stat that by 2050, the scientists believe that half of the places that have hosted Winter Olympics in the past would no longer be able to do it. They just won't have the snow cover and the conditions to make it viable. You might remember as recently as 2018 in the US Open, heat breaks being given to players because of extreme temperatures that were experienced during the competition there. And for slightly different reasons, during 2000, disruption to the Australian Open where players were pulling out because the air quality was so bad due to increased incidence of wildfires. And a bit closer to home, there's a stat I read the other day that something like 25% of our UK Football League grounds are at risk of being either partially or fully inundated on a reasonably regular basis by 2050 because they happen to be in low-lying areas, and we expect the combination of that and the increased impact of storms to be taking their toll. So some very clear sort of disruptive things to think about. Not to mention all the disruption you can imagine to just your daily travel arrangements if you're trying to get somewhere where sport often requires us to sort of travel. So, let's be honest, we're all part of this problem and sport's no exception. Globally, it's estimated that the carbon footprint of sport is about the same as that of a medium-sized country. And that comes from transportation, it comes from construction and operation of venues and buildings, it comes from all the sort of emissions generated in the supply chain to keep sport happening, and it also comes from waste generation in sporting venues and associated activities. But much more positively, sport is also potentially a massive part of the solution. And I think that's for several reasons, which are really quite well articulated in a report that Deloitte produced last year about the role of sport in tackling climate change. First of all, it's got huge reach, massive fan base, massive levels of participation, engages with all sections of society, and just has this unique ability to bring people together and to initiate and influence change. Secondly, through finance. So typically, this is in bigger, more organized sort of sporting context, venues, stadiums, they can be used to model good practice, deliver clean energy, promote responsible consumption, for example, through recycling and good waste management practices. Collaboration, I think, is something where sport has a role to play. Partnerships in sport allow organizations to really sort of leverage each other's influence to achieve that sort of shared goal. And a very good example of that is the university's partnership with Reading FC through Hoops for the Future. There's a lot of resource in sport, human resource and volunteer time, a big employee base and a big volunteer base. And if every one of those people is taking a small action, that is both delivering benefit in and of itself, but it's also setting a positive example for others to follow. And also, I think legacy is a word we often hear associated with sport, isn't it? Cooperation between sports organisations, political organisations, and other stakeholders, can really be a very powerful tool for creating a very positive legacy in terms of sustainability. And I think also worth saying, sport can help by helping itself. If you're reducing your energy use, your water use, your waste generation as a sports organisation, that's probably going to contribute towards reducing your costs, particularly at the moment with energy prices so high and volatile and showing no signs of becoming less so anytime soon. Sporting organisations and organisations like Nick are always trying to increase participation and inclusion. You know, if we can address some of the sort of transport and access issues that people face in a way that is compatible with our desire to reduce emissions, you know, that can be a win-win. At a slightly sort of more infrastructural level, there are things we can do which will help improve the resilience of places where sport happens, and make them sort of less vulnerable to those sort of impacts that I've talked about. So, for example, I mean, I used to stand on a windy touchline watching my son play his under 11s football. There was a row of poplars which you know, previous generations had the good wisdom to plant, and they were essential protection for chilly parents shivering on the sidelines. But you know, in the way that we design and plan our sporting venues and activities in future, you know, things like that, we might have to take decisions now which we won't see the benefit of immediately, but which can help future generations to make sure they're better prepared for the impacts they're going to see in future. And of course, taking action on climate also builds positive reputation. I think there was a survey recently that said 74% of football fans were concerned about their club's environmental impacts. And an even higher percentage said they wanted to see their club taking action on the environment in the way that they've taken action on social issues. For example, you know, the contribution that football's made to the Black Lives Matter movement, and putting the issue of race on the agenda and getting it talked about, and in a very positive and meaningful way. So those are my headlines. I'll be really, really keen to hear, particularly from others in the room, about what they're doing, and particularly from Russell and Chris about the work that BASIS is doing, because I'm sure you can probably relate some of that to the more sort of local and grassroots level, which is really what we, you know, probably where most of the activity and most of the difference can be made. But it's yeah, we need to get everybody shoulders to the wheel on climate change. Nick in his introduction said that, you know, he's got a day job and the climate stuff's on top of that. I think most people are in that same space. And I suppose if there's one message I want to leave you with, is that we all, because it's just such a big issue and it will impact us all eventually, I think what we need to do is all make climate change a bit of our day job. And if there's a lot of us are doing that, then I'm sure we can, you know, make some progress and achieve some positive outcomes. This is just my last slide to give you a signpost to more information about the strategy that we've adopted in Reading and the work of the Climate Change Partnership. The public-facing sort of brand of the partnership is the Reading Climate Action Network, and their website, readingcan.org.uk, has got sort of resources and pointers and tips. You can interrogate it from the point of view of either an individual as an organisation, and it works through various levels of advice and guidance, and signposts to other sources of advice and guidance, depending on whether you're sort of just starting out on your climate journey or some way down the track. So do check that out. And also a little plug there for those who can make it for, I can't see it because my slide is so small, Nick, but yeah, we've got a Reading Business Climate Fair taking place at Green Park on the 22nd of November. The link there is on the slide, and you're all welcome to turn up, register for that, and join us in the discussions we're going to have at that event. I think I'll hand back to you at that point, Nick. That's right.
Thank you, Peter. That was very insightful. Yeah, full of information and ideas. Very inspiring, interesting presentation. Thank you. I'm just going to see if I have got control back. Yes, I have. Okay, so a couple of slides from me. I'm not going to repeat the things that Peter has said, set out the case, you know, very eloquently for how there is a connection between sport and climate change, and potentially some of the things that we might want to think about doing to sort of get involved. From Get Back Attractive's perspective, there's a real overlap with what we're trying to do as an organisation, and what we're trying to do does reflect what the network in Berkshire are trying to do. So those common goals where the agendas overlap, we are trying to tackle social issues. We're trying to help people that suffer from inequalities, and it very much maps with the fact that those who are affected by climate will be disproportionately affected if they are from a disadvantaged background. And so the groups we're trying to support actually are very similar, and the system changes that are needed, probably with very similar decision makers as well. And a lot of that will be through kind of partnerships and networks and looking at that system piece. And I think we real kind of allies in terms of being able to support each other's agendas to do that. Peter's talked quite a lot there about the impact on sport and gave some great examples. And I'd invite you to think about what that might look like for community sport. And there's a great picture there on the right. Is that the way we want to be playing football in the future? It looks quite good fun, and maybe that is a hybrid version that might be quite good fun. But ultimately, that's probably not going to be a good thing for participation long term. The other thing we need to think about is the physiological impacts. So we've alluded to professional sport and how people have had to take breaks in competitions. But actually, when you're talking about children taking part in sport and the temperatures are up in the mid-30s and above, the damage that may do to young people, to old people, it's going to reduce the levels of activities overall. And we know that in turn will damage both the sports system, but also, people as individuals, and put more pressure on the health infrastructure. So we need to be aware of that. And as a sector, we've got to think about what the impact on cancellations will mean for participation, for the income of our venues and our organizations, but then also how we run our facilities, how we adjust to the pressures on the energy supply, and how energy supplies and the energy mix will change, will affect how we operate. And right the way through to government policy, we know that Reading Council, for example, have some local policies that will affect potentially how local organisations and businesses operate, and the same from government policy. We need to be prepared as a sector for those changes that will probably come down the line. And as Peter alluded to, probably the biggest thing is being aware of our fans and our memberships, to understand what their view of climate change is and what they think we should be doing, and how much they will support us or even encourage or force us to change as organisations. As the next generation come through, they're much more aware, they're much more keyed into this agenda, and they're more likely to be putting pressure on us as leaders to make some changes. So these are all things we need to consider and be ready for. Couple of things here, just where we looked at the climate strategy in Reading and looked at all the crossover with what we are trying to do and what the sector are doing. And there's lots and lots of areas where we are very closely aligned. And the middle group of 7 there, you can see this thing, there's areas around health, around mental health, the economy, that we at GBA are doing work on as our partners in the sector. And they're very much at the heart of what the climate strategy in the borough are trying to do as well. So clear alignment where we can help each other. And then these are the sorts of ways that Get Butt Attractive work that will support climate change, and where we can influence across our networks and what we fund, how we fund things, the way that we run programs, the way that we get involved in system change work, which all aligns, and where we can support, and vice versa, where Peter, his colleagues, other officers working in the climate change agenda can align with what we're doing. So I'll pause there. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I'm really keen to bring you all into the discussion and to get that conversation going. Before we go into sort of just some prompt questions, I'll stop sharing. It would be really good to get your feedback on what you've heard so far. Just a kind of top line, any comments, questions? What do you think of what you've heard?
I'll jump in there. I think you've done a great job at pulling it all together and finding all the intersections with sport, both professional and recreational. What Peter said about the fact that most people don't have sustainability in their job titles, and it's something that's added or bolted onto a lot of roles. Even I, in my role as chair of BASIS, it's a voluntary role. It's not, and so I have to do other things to keep myself able to chair it. And until that changes, you just get the feeling you're not going to have that priority put onto it. And your point around adopting the same kind of what would be the right urgency, you know, around Black Lives Matters and the other social inequality campaigns that have been run is massively important. And you just still get the feeling like you're talking into a void in some cases. And our role at BASIS really is, as a network, it's to try and bring all those people. So it's more about the influencing and helping the changes happen there. And you made some great points there about, you know, looking at how things could change. Now, no, Nick, if you went on Russ's course, then you know you've a lot of that was discussed about, you know, how do you make the influences at the right levels with the right people, and it's great having the you know the chairman, and I know that chairman actually sort of really translates into General Dog's Body, which is what our chair of cricket club, the same thing. And it's, you know, the sustainability element of trying to introduce that even at that level is really difficult. The club that I'm at, trying to have those conversations, like, you know, what we're talking about here now, is really difficult. It's not something that immediately, you know, clicks with most people. It's, oh yeah, but that's going to cost us money. It's going to cost us this, that, and the next thing. And then trying to explain, well, yes, it is going to cost you money and it's going to cost you your life in 20, 30 years if we don't do anything. So those conversations are tough to have. And until we break through that kind of little barriers.
Yeah, Peter, you're going to probably get quoted by me, actually. So there you go. There's fame for you in future. But your comment at the end there, echoing what was just said, that we all need to make climate change a bit of our day job. And I think that's the point we haven't got to yet, because it feels like, not that my colleagues in Active Surrey, which mirrors Nick's operation, it's not that they don't care. It's just that at the moment it feels like I'm a bit of a lone voice. But it's just bringing that to life. I mean, we've done it with some of our own events this year. We've kind of taken steps to cut print use, cut plastic use, all those kind of things. So we're kind of tinkering with those things and making positive changes, but it's stopping that from being an exception and just making it something that's on everybody's minds, kind of naturally, I suppose. All of us thinking, what minor changes, and let's face it, they're going to have to be minor at this stage to get buy-in. What changes can we make in order to encourage people to come on side? And then we get to the whole kind of making it compulsory later on if we're not getting enough shift. But that's what we're trying to do. That's what I'm trying to do at my end anyways, is encourage people along with us rather than coming in heavy-handed.
Thank you, Bob. Yeah, sorry, I dropped out there at the point where I ended the presentation. I got kicked out, so thank you for those comments. Peter, were you coming back on Bob's comment, or was it something separate?
I was, if Stuart doesn't mind me queue jumping. Just to that lone voice point, Stuart, I mean, I spent years of my career feeling like I was, you know, shouting into the toilet bowl and no one was listening, but it is changing, I think. And you know, that one of the upsides of those impacts I talked about, that will force people to confront the realities. You know, if you haven't got climate risk in your risk management framework, you're probably not being a very responsible organization right now. And if it gets into that risk management framework, certainly for the bigger organizations that have that kind of thing, then, you know, it'll have to be somebody's job. So I think that will change whether we like it or not. The generational thing that Nick talked about earlier is also driving it. You know, younger people are switched onto this, and they do have reasonable expectations that we won't just you know, walk away from the mess that we've created for them. But I think you've got to have the conversation with people on their terms and meet them where they are rather than where you wish with them to be, haven't you? So if I'm talking to my finance director about my aspirations to you know, do a new solar program for our council buildings and car parks, I've got to show him the financial benefit of that, as well as the carbon benefit, because he probably cares a bit more about the former than the latter. Or if I'm talking to our public health colleagues or housing colleagues, you know, I remind them that, you know, climate impacts the most vulnerable the worst, because they're the ones who are least well equipped to adapt. And all of a sudden they can see that, actually I care about vulnerable people, so I probably ought to care about this. So there's a little bit of finding the issue that connects with with other stakeholders to bring them into the conversation, I think.
Yeah, totally agree. Thank you, Peter. Yeah, similar at Get Back Attractive, I've outlined a couple of areas where we've seen the synergy, and actually working with and through Peter and the connections he's helped us to make actually is helping support a number of the agendas that we're working on for Sport England. So it's just finding some of those synergies. Stuart, sorry we kept you waiting. Come in.
That's fine. I would say there's some really encouraging information there that's come out, but this situation of whether you're a lone voice or not, I think is just like other changes that have taken time to get going. In the rugby situation, 25 years ago, females playing rugby was, you what? Really? Surely they don't want to do that. And yet, actually, by giving people a chance and raising it up the agenda, there was pretty quick transformation. And you're right, you've got to work on people's talk on their own terms. So when you point out that actually, the women's team suddenly is generating, I can't remember rough terms, let's say, 25 people paying 150 quid match subs, yearly subscriptions, that's a chunk of money coming in. When you've got two women who are on the executive committee, and so what we call the volunteer base, those things all count, and you just need to look at where you are making wins. I think it's actually awareness is shared more broadly than sometimes people realise. And in our rugby club, the catering manager last year approached me and said, "Stuart, we're going to get rid of single-use plastics." I went, "Oh, right." Nobody had decided this. Nobody had mandated it. She's a 60-ish-year-old lady, and she decided she didn't like all these piles of plastic, and so over a very short time, she said it'll cost us a bit more initially, but we're going to go to recyclables on the the food and drink dispense and reusable stuff. So that was good. I thought it was really encouraging, Peter, to see those stats on how Reading as a town has made good progress. I think that's very important, because too often there's a sort of doom and we're all doomed kind of overlay to these discussions, and to show that things are coming down rapidly and significantly anyway, across quite a wide range, I thought was really good. And the more we can publish the good news, the better to me. That's it.
Great, thank you, Stuart. Yeah, really relevant points that you've raised there, and it puts it into context, doesn't it, thinking about how these small changes all start to add up, and how they come about. That, as you say, if we just keep talking about this and enough of us talk about it, a few more people each time will start to pick up the message and start to change the way they think, which is, even if we just do that within our clubs, that's probably a good place to start. Russell, got your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I think Stuart's just made some excellent points, and it shows how clubs are actually developing, and sometimes things just kind of happen. And when you do take a closer look, you suddenly realize actually there are 4 or 5 different things coming together, and nobody's ever pulled these together into some kind of strategy, but they're just kind of organically happening because we're going that direction. But that was just sort of reinforce Stuart's thing, and I think that's great what the club's already doing things. It is going to come down to a point where some clubs are forced to do it, because frankly, anybody managing a local club already has 101 other things to do, and there's never enough time in the day to manage that club properly and fully and to the best of your ability, the way you want to. So for somebody to come in and say, well, what about climate? And you just kind of go, well, I don't understand it. It's a big issue. Sometimes people feel that their efforts can't actually make a lot of difference, but I think you've already in your presentations already explained how sport really has a massive opportunity to just communicate this in a language that people actually understand. So the actual point I'm coming to and was going to make is around the code for sports governance now for Sport England, UK Sport, for funding, actually has a requirement in there for any organisation getting funding, tier 3 funding, so it is the more organised, the bigger grants, I guess, from Sport England. You actually have to demonstrate that the board is taking into account environmental impacts of their decisions. Now, I don't think that's had an impact yet, but as soon as one club is told, well, you've not demonstrated that you've taken this into account, so we're pulling out your funding, that will make people listen. And I don't like the idea that this has to be the stick over the carrot, but actually having those requirements in place is going to push this a bit more. So there is a carrot and stick approach. We can let it develop organically, but maybe we don't necessarily have time for that, and it needs to be pushed a bit more strongly. And I think when you have conversations with people, they're willing to have these conversations. They're open to it. They just need to understand a bit more about how they can do these things. Every venue, whether you're a professional venue or a recreational club, you're going to have some level of catering operations in place. You've got waste management issues to deal with. So you're not actually doing something new, you're just doing something differently to start with. So there will be a level of compulsion at some point, but this organic growth, I think, is good, but very sympathetic to that lone voice issue. But there are probably multiple people in each club who think they are the lone voice. And pull those 4 or 5 people together, and you may actually have a really productive group there, possibly.
Yeah, well said, Russell. Thank you. Yeah, completely agree that the influence of funding can lead to places that you didn't expect it to. So I'll give you one example very quickly before I come to you, Ellie. We've recently been distributing the Together Fund on behalf of Sport England, and at a local level, we've got the kind of autonomy to be able to shape local priorities of how we distribute that funding. And one of the things that we've said within that is that we want to work on system level change. So we could just give it out to individual projects. We could just work on projects that, get a group of people active for, and provide a couple of £1,000 of funding to get, one group active. But what we said was, if you can come to us with something that thinks more about what you can change in the system, we will look at that as a priority to fund you. And that's changed the conversations with a number of organisations, and that's starting to lead to changes further up the system rather than just at the delivery level. And it's a similar thing with this. As an onward funder, we may be able to start bringing in just some some nudges. So we probably won't bring in rules, but there may be some things we can nudge within how we distribute funding to encourage people to just tell us what their sustainability policy is, and that puts it on the agenda of people applying just to GBA for funding. So it's just another small shift that we might be able to do as an organisation. We haven't signed that off. That's just me thinking of ways that we could do some of the things that you're suggesting. Thank you for that. Ellie, do you want to come in?
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to sort of reinforce what Russell said and say I agree how in terms of our sort of journey has started from different departments being asked for their environmental sustainability sort of evidence. So I'm our governance lead, and I talked about we have to do our capability, and it was a new category in that to do environmental sustainability. And then from another department in our activities department, they do primary stars. So they go into primary schools and they do sort of PSHE, and it's cropped up in there that they want to sort of include more stuff about climate change and environmental sustainability. And then we've got someone who does our funding and looks for grants, and it's something that they need. So one of the things I have to do is create a working group, and it's almost like we've sort of created it, like it's sort of happened already because everyone's being asked of it. So we're going to do it all together, and then the football club has started doing it as well, and then approached us. So we're all being asked of it, and that's how it's sort of being spurred on. Yeah, so I don't really feel like a lone voice at the moment because, like you said, we've had a few lone voices, and now we've sort of clocked on, and we're all going to sort of go through it together. So I'm quite looking forward to it, to be honest, working with other people and doing it. So hopefully it'll be good.
Yeah, sounds great. You're creating a kind of momentum, aren't you, with those advocates coming together, and perhaps that's something from this in Berkshire, if there are just a handful of organisations that want to get together and share what we're doing from time to time, that may build into something bigger. Okay, any other comments at this stage from what we've talked about so far? Any responses to things people have raised? Okay, how do we kind of feel as a sector then? Where do you think we're at in terms of our journey, do we feel this is something that our sports and our organisations are really looking to do change on at a sort of leadership level at the moment? Should we just explore kind of leadership and whether this comes up at your board meetings and things, or any thoughts on that? Ellie?
We've so part of our capabilities that we need environmental sustainability trustee. So we now have a member of our board who, like, that is not their sole role, but that is what they're like focused on. And I have monthly meetings with him just to talk about our progress against our action plan and what we can do. And he's going to be a part of our working group. And then we report back. We're going to report back to the board at our board meetings on what we're doing with environmental sustainability. So we're quite fortunate that we've got that drive at board level from the start of our journey.
Okay, thanks, Ellie. So you've got quite high level buy-in, which really helps, I can imagine, when you need to get things done. Be interested to see that your club's obviously, a slightly different scale in terms of your reach and the size of the operation. Stuart, any thoughts from a kind of smaller community club level?
Yeah, I had a lot of empathy with Russell's comment. We are largely, not wholly, but largely a volunteer-run organisation. We have a small core of part-time paid people, and I often think my role is spinning a lot of plates. Hopefully, there's not many on the floor, but there's always a few that are wobbly. And adding things in is always, oh, dear me, do we need to do that or not? But so I think actually it is about understanding that you can incorporate moves to address the climate issue as just part of normal business, and certainly don't give it to one person like, it's your job to do the climate thing. It just needs to be in the discussion. So when we're planning our clubhouse renovation, that we're building into that, of course, there's insulation, rainwater collection, all these kind of things. But I suppose because I do have a reasonable awareness of that, then it doesn't come it's not difficult for me to introduce that in there. And I've just got to every now and then sort of correct people's thinking if they think, well, that's just making life more difficult. It's difficult enough, that's making it more difficult. I don't think it does often make life more difficult. And I think it's dead right that a combination of carrot and stick is what's needed. So the carrot is, yes, your bills will be lower on energy or maintenance or waste management. But the carrot, it probably best not to be heavy-handed regulation, but yeah, funding preferences for things which meet the climate agenda more closely is a very good direction in which to go, I think, because then people will work towards that. So yeah, but it is the real world in voluntary run sports organizations is that there's always more to do than there is time and hands to do it. So you've got to be a bit canny about how you manage the priorities.
Yeah, I agree. I recognise that as a kind of coach myself, and this runs into 4 or 5 nights a week where I'm coaching my spare time. Chris, do you want to come in?
Yeah, and absolutely. Similarly, I coach, umpire, do all the voluntary stuff. And listening to what Stuart was saying there, certainly at club level, there is the ability to do some of the influencing if you get those sort of group of like-minded people together. But there's a responsibility that sits further up the chain, and that's obviously through national governing bodies, RFU, ECB, England Hockey, all the others, and the messaging that comes out through them. The messaging is fine coming from the governing bodies, but the next level down are the leagues who actually drive most of participation in organised sport. And at the moment, I don't think I haven't come across a league that's totally bought into the messaging around how do we change our fixture lists, how do we look at the way, all of which is obviously driven by the sort of need to improve the competitive side of your leagues, but there are ways of looking at it. Kent, for example, has just amalgamated its the two big leagues into one, and there was no mention in the rationale for that. Oh, this could be a chance for us to look at the way that we've structured this league, and can we reduce traveling distances, and that sort of thing. Leagues have a huge amount of influence, again, on the way that clubs behave and interact and all the rest. And say the problem at the moment is that the messaging doesn't come out through there, and it should be, because that's where you're going to make the difference. That's where you're really going to have both the kind of governance being imposed, and I use that in parentheses, and also changes being required to be made if you want to be part of that league. So there's still, I think, a long way to go. So whilst the RFU and the ECB do put out a lot of messaging around sustainability, they're talking to, in the ECB's case, 8,500 clubs. In rugby, it's 3,500, 4,000. And I know, as a chair, and I'm sure Stuart does, you get 100 emails, from your governing body on all kinds of different things. So the sustainability one is, oh yeah, okay, that's one of 20, 30, 40 that you might get a month. So yeah, that I think is a challenge for sport, organised sport I'm talking about. How do we drive that messaging down to where it's actually going to make changes? And like Russ referred to Sport England and the, finally putting something into their funding criteria around sustainability. I mean, it's taken them, God, well, I was at the ECB for 14 years and we were talking about it when I started, and when I'd left, they still hadn't done it. So it's, but, these things can't take that long anymore. This is where we have to compress these timescales into like next year, next month, or whatever it is. I'll shut up there.
Yeah, I think we probably all agree with that. It's about how do we change some of the decisions, some of the influences more quickly, and it's above our pay grade, I suppose. And it's interesting thinking about it from a volunteer point of view. Where have I heard or seen within the clubs that I'm involved in and my children are involved in, any of those influences? There's one or two things perhaps behind the scenes happening, like Stuart mentioned around kind of reducing plastics. There is a bit of that happening, but outside of that, there isn't the messaging really coming through anywhere that even attempts to mention sustainability. So yeah, and perhaps we'll come on to that a little bit later about what are the practical things we might be able to do to help sort of support. Peter.
No, just as Christopher was talking, I was struck by that. It's really interesting, that question about governance and waiting for the top-down sort of instruction. I suppose a parallel in my world would be, the regime of statutory obligation on local authorities from central government in relation to climate change is non-existent. There's no real, given how important an issue it is, it's quite terrifying that government doesn't really require us to do anything. And the great thing about local authorities is we didn't wait for that diktat to be handed down. In fact, it was local authorities declaring climate emergencies and adopting ambitious targets that ultimately forced Parliament's hand and made the UK government recognise the urgency of the issue and pass its own Climate Change Act, which committed them to a slightly less ambitious targets of net zero by 2050. So we all have that power, don't we, as individual organisations, to set our own sort of trajectories, and that will drive the debate at sort of higher tiers. So I suppose the lesson of that is you don't necessarily have to wait, even though we all know it would be much more helpful if that were coming down from on high. I think, and something else somebody said earlier about getting others to take their share of responsibility. I don't know if it helps, but when I started at Reading, there was a sense that everybody's inbox had got a climate thing in it, and they were waiting for me to arrive, and then they sent it to me. So I just send it back. So when the finance people sent me an invitation to a seminar on green finance, I said, yeah, that looks really interesting. You should go to that. And the fleet guy sent me an invitation to an event about green fleet. I'm like, yep, definitely. You want to make sure you're there, mate. you just got to be a bit sort of cheeky sometimes. But it is, the only other thing, and the other thing you can do, I suppose, is I'm unusual in that climate is my day job, but I make it my business to bring climate into the bits of my job that aren't my day job. So if nobody in our organisation wants to do the strategic risk register or the corporate plan input, so I put my hand up for those things, and I say, oh, I'll have a go at that, and then I can make sure that those climate messages and targets are incorporated in those sort of corporate mechanisms, which tend to be quite powerful but boring, and make sure that you get involved in those as well.
Thank you, Peter. I think your point there is a really important one that, since I've started talking to you, has really come through, that there's this fear that the government doesn't really get the climate agenda. It's not a priority. They're not really driving it. And in fact, they're kind of unwinding some of the, commitments they made previously. But actually, at local government level, you can make a massive impact, and the local government is just cracking on and doing what central government should perhaps have been doing.
Well, and newsflash, if anybody's out there waiting for fracking to reduce their energy bills, you're going to have a long wait. So, it's a lot of there's some ideological nonsense flying around in the energy debate at the moment. Meanwhile, we've all got energy bills to pay, and anything we can all do to reduce our energy bills, and solar, like I say, is the business case for solar is fantastic at the moment. And those of us who didn't do it 5 years ago are now wishing we had. So there's a lesson there as well, I think, that energy markets are going to be volatile and risky for the foreseeable, and we might as well get on with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it is reassuring to see the local powers that be putting some checks and balances in place and making some good decisions. So yeah, Russell, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. And since I raised my hand, I think we've started touching on a bit more political and national government and that sort of thing. So I'm not going to go that way, because it could take a long time to try and unpick some of those things that are happening at the moment. But it does relate to the point I was going to make, and that is that, so of our sector, sport, recreation and physical activity, we're not going to solve this by ourselves. And I don't think we should beat ourselves up over that. And I don't think we should necessarily be the ones. What I'm trying to say is we shouldn't think we have to find solutions for all of this, because we work in partnership with all sorts of other organizations. If you're a professional venue, or even if you're a sort of reasonable sized recreational venue, you have relationships with other organizations, whether it's with the local council, even purely from the terms of, it might be the council that picks up your waste, and so you need to understand what the recycling opportunities are there. Or if you're a professional venue, you'll have a multi-million-pound contract with a catering supplier to come in and serve all of the 30, 40, 50,000 people coming into your venue. You can ask questions of those people as well. So it's just about that awareness raising piece, knowing that your club wants to participate in this, maybe understanding the reasons why it's important for your club to participate in this, because a lot of sports venues, recreational sport, frankly, they're situated on what can I call it, sort of lower grade land that you can't build houses on, quite often on floodplains, maybe, because you can't use those for other purposes. So you need a large piece of flat land. A river floodplain is a perfect place, but then you're going to have other impacts around, when climate change happens, more frequent flooding for those spaces, you can't use them, waterlogging, all those kinds of issues. So use these relationships that are there, I think, is what I'm saying, whether they're, like I say, with a council, because you're using council space for your activities, or whether it's with a big commercial company, because there are other people also working on these issues, and it's not just for us. We often take it on board, particularly volunteers. So many volunteers kind of take on so much responsibility, which is great. That they're proud of their club and they want to do things with their club. But you kind of take on everything, and you take on more, and you keep going, and it becomes overwhelming. So rely on others as well. Rely on those relationships that you've got with other organizations, because they're all going to be looking at these issues as well.
Yeah, it's a great point. And there are, these partnership groups that already exist, where part of our role might be about just helping people to get involved in those other groups where their support feels like strength in numbers. Stuart.
Yeah, just back on the earlier comment about the importance of leagues. I was thinking about the travel implications. Our men's first team got promoted one league over the summer. The result of that is that we are traveling substantially further. And I think in any kind of pyramid structure, the further you go up, if you're in a national structure, the more likely you're going to be traveling further and further. And our neighbours, Rams Rugby, just down the road, are in level 3 of rugby, which is they're in the top 40 or 50 clubs, and their travel is horrendous. You know, they go from Reading to Darlington, Mowden Park, and they go down to Plymouth Albion or somebody, and Caldy up in the Wirralls. So are we saying that there might be a situation where people would trade off advancing in leagues for reducing the geography, or does it change the competitive dynamics a bit? Just a thought, really. I'm not sure.
To jump in, yeah, exactly. I mean, that's absolutely where the pinch point comes, and I don't think it should. I mean, I'm a competitive person, and I would hate to think that you weren't able to make it into as far as you can as a sports person to be able to compete at the highest level. So I don't, and I think that's where reality kind of bites, if you like, and it's where you need to mitigate. Okay, and there are ways of mitigating, and I think Russ and I, Russ always makes the point, and Nick, he made it in the course. Sport will always continue, and this is not about trying to stop sport happening. It's about how do we find ways of enabling sport to be its most sustainable that it can be.
Yeah. Peter Moore.
Just muting Peter there. I don't think he realised his mic was on. Yeah, really interesting comments from both of you there. That how far do you go with trying to mitigate and offset the impacts? And perhaps you will get to a stage where either it's too expensive to travel. For some teams, if you haven't got the finances and cost of energy keeps going up and potential impacts and everything, you may get to that stage. But I don't think we're there, certainly not yet, and we won't be for a while yet. It's perhaps more about how do you just bring down the cost of that travel or the impact of it. And when I look at the amount of travel I'm doing, I spend a fortune on it, ferrying my children around, several sessions every weekend. We're going further and further afield the more they move up, through competitive leagues and start getting into county structures and things like that. We drive a long way, and often driving on our own because it's convenient. But actually, there's lots of people doing the same thing from the same area, and we could just lift share. Straight away, that would be one easy way of reducing the overall carbon footprint. But we have to change mindsets as behavior change again, because most people don't want to lift share. They are used to getting in their car and just driving straight off their driveway, and you don't have to worry about taking an extra 3 minutes to pick somebody up. It's just not our culture, and perhaps that's one of the things we need to look at. Ellie.
Hi, yeah, just talking about travel. Mine's sort of in a different context, but we were sort of thinking the same as you. We've got an alternative provision, and a lot of those children come in by taxis every day, and that's something we flagged up in our impact review, our impact report. And also, like, all of our coaches travel out to different venues, locations every day, so it's a lot of everyone driving. And we were like, well, we can't, obviously we're not going to stop these people from coming, and we can't stop our coaches from driving around. So one thing we're going to try and do is try and make all of our company cars electric, or try and get 50% of them by next year to be electric. So instead of thinking about how we're going to stop from doing something, just trying to reduce our impact on what we're doing. So that's kind of how we're approaching it.
Yeah, that's brilliant, isn't it? That's similar to the point Peter made, that they just have got the authority, the autonomy to change the type of vehicles they use. And it's the same, you know, with you. If you've got that kind of influence, then why not? You know, and on the other side, we can probably influence our memberships just by encouraging them. You know, when we send out messages about traveling to matches, why not? You know, it doesn't cost anything to add a one-liner about maybe just share a lift. You know, and you might get to know some of the other parents, the kids get to know each other a bit better, and you know, you have a chat on the way down as well. You know, Russell.
And just adding, Nick, to your previous comment as well about, you know, we don't lift share, we're used to getting in our cars and driving places, and expanding on my previous comment as well about our relationships with sort of contracted organizations and whatever. There's a societal change here as well, and sport has to be ready to reflect that societal change. Now, we're not there, and like you say, you know, so many parents with children of a certain age who are active in sport will, I'll say complain, they do it willingly, but they'll complain that so much of their time is taken, as you say, referring to different, particularly if you've got children who are interested in different sports or different ages, and all these things are happening and you've got to coordinate this. I'm pretty sure there would be a relief among a good proportion of those parents if they know that just for at least 1 or 2 occasions a week, they know that somebody else that they trust is going to pick up their son or daughter, take them and bring them back. So I'm sure there would be a willingness if within a club somebody started to coordinate lift shares, etc., etc. Now that is then going to spread into society more generally. It will be, well, maybe we don't need to drive so much. Maybe next time I've only got to go a mile to the shop, I can actually walk for 15 or 20 minutes. And now we're getting into that physical activity side of things where sport can relate to recreation and physical activity. So all these things are being linked up. So I think what active partnerships are doing, making sure this links back to physical activity as well as organized sport, is really important. But that whole societal change needs to come about as well.
I can tell you that from my experience of having 2 teenage boys who were involved in rugby and basketball, the best way to make yourself popular is to do what we did and buy a Ford Galaxy. Suddenly you can take half the team with you. These days, if it was an electric Ford Galaxy, then you know you're really ticking the boxes. But even if the kids hadn't been very good, I think they'd all have got selected because the dad was going to drive half the team. So.
Yeah, I can see by the laughter around the group that there's a lot of people that are, you know, going to experience that very thing. Peter.
Sorry if this was covered while I had to take that call, but I guess one of the real wins is if we can get the participation up, that ought to make the geography easier, shouldn't it? You know, I wouldn't, if there were more kids playing in my son's Sunday league, I wouldn't have had to take him to the other end of the county to get a match. Do you know what I mean? There'd be more clubs closer by, and that density would help us. So that's probably the big win in this, isn't it? Is to get that health and activity win from your perspective, Nick. And the environmental gains is to make it more compact, you know. And the elite stuff, I mean, that's, to take that point, you know, but the more elite it gets, the more resource there generally is to lead by example. But that's kind of the problem for the elites rather than us talking about this at sort of grassroots level.
Yeah, that's true. But as you say, if they are leading by example, you know, we've got Reading Football Club in the room. You know, Reading Football Club are starting to use electric vehicles, as Ellie's kind of pointed out. And, you know, if other clubs see that happening, you know, and the messaging coming from them is this is important, I think that does filter down. It does start to shift mindsets, you know, in other clubs. Stuart.
Yeah, a couple of weekends ago, I went to a thing called the RFU Community Rugby Congress, and this was trying to look at where rugby will be in 5 and 10 years' time, given the opportunities but also the challenges. One of the things that came out of that was that the non-contact forms of rugby, like touch rugby, tag rugby, walking rugby, have got a lot of potential in terms of appeal to people who don't want to whack into each other, but like chucking an oval ball around. And it was a really interesting point made, which was that all those forms of rugby are dead easy to set up almost anywhere. You need a flat piece of space. It can be a park, it can be a school playing field. You can do it on hard surfaces even, and you just need a few cones. And I think it was an interesting point there that clubs with their own facilities tend to want the world to come to them, but there may be actually lots of benefits, both environmental and engagement by going out to the world. You know, park run's an interesting example, isn't it? You could do an equivalent thing by just saying, well, every Saturday at 11 o'clock, you know, down at Prospect Park, there's a pick up teams touch rugby session, and just put the cones down, off you go. Those people can walk there or jump on their bike instead of having to travel across the other side of Reading, clock up some carbon footprint. So turning round the sort of convention that we're a club, we've got grounds, you come to us, could have an interesting contribution to make, I think. Before I finish, I'll need to leave around about 12:30, folks. But so if I don't have anything more to say, then it's been very interesting, and look forward to talking to some more of you again.
Right, thanks, Stuart, and yeah, on behalf of the group, thanks for coming along, giving us your insight. It's been really
Pleasure.
useful. Thank you. Yeah, you touched on Parkrun there. Mark's put a note in the chat there about Parkrun and the impact on the environment that's sort of coming through from Parkrun, because of the kind of structure and the regulations around how we put things on. So perhaps there is something we need to think about. Yes, we want more local activity. It will definitely get people more active, which is what we want to achieve. And the more local it is, the less impact probably on the travel element. But we also need to mitigate at the same time kind of what impact that might have on the local area.
Yep.
Okay. So is there anything that we haven't touched on that any of you wanted to raise about any learning you've got from your kind of sports, your operations, anything that you feel is, you know, kind of a burning, you know, kind of golden nugget that you really wanted to share with the group, that you've seen some good practice or anything? Kind of pulled most of that out already. Peter.
Very quickly, and the bigger you are, the more important this is. There's something about understanding where your emissions are coming from. So this is the process that the football club, the Reading Football Club, will be going through now. We've done that a long time ago as a council, but there are ways to do that at a smaller scale and various tools to help you with that. Because that's really, you know, there's a danger you're sort of aiming at the wrong targets if you don't know where your sort of footprint really is, you know. So there's perhaps a little bit of work for organisations to think about there, and then you can tackle it. And it's usually buildings and transport. Those are usually the two biggies. Yeah, happy to talk to people further about some of the ways I might work that out.
Okay, that's great. So there might be a bit of help from the council in being able to help small organisations identify and look at ways that they could do some of that change. Great.
Yeah, well, sorry, that was me raising my hand. And yes, that's exactly where some of the funding should be aimed at, is helping people measure so that you know what it is actually that you need to tackle. So just as an example of great practice, there is a cricket club that's, you know, that they off entirely their own volition that have decided to, you know, have a look at their carbon footprint, look at how they go about reducing it, considering, you know, from biodiversity to obviously changing the light bulbs but they've done the whole kind of scoping, but entirely off their own bat. And that, you know, that wasn't driven by messaging they'd got from the NGBs or their local council or anything like that. So I do think that's where you could aim some funding at, you know, doing a big measuring type initiative. The trouble is, of course, all the 2-bit cowboy consultants would jump in on it, but still, maybe the outcome would be better than.
Yeah, and of course, with most community clubs, it then requires somebody to have the time and the skills and everything else to actually undertake that piece of work. So yeah, it's one to think about, isn't it? So can we do it? How will we do it locally? Okay, so it feels like we've probably flushed out most of the things we wanted to cover in this conversation. Is there anything else that anybody wanted to say? Any thoughts on what we've talked about today? It would be good to get some, you know, sort of next steps. I just wonder, for those organisations locally, is there a willingness, a interest in meeting up again in a few months' time, just to kind of share notes? And could just be 20 minutes or something, but might be more than that. Russell?
Yeah, I mean, I should have pointed this out at the beginning when I actually introduced myself, and say that although BASIS is a national organisation, I'm actually Reading born and bred and live in Reading, and I'd be very happy to sort of participate and give some of the resources that we've developed. We do a certification scheme, which now it really, I'll be honest and say, it really sits with professional venues, but we're adapting it and we're using it with the cricket club that Chris has mentioned. We're trying to adapt that so it works for a recreational club. It's not quite so intensive in terms of what we're asking for. So absolutely, I'd be very happy to speak with local clubs. Not suggesting we have all of the answers, and really we're all about facilitating clubs to develop their own solutions. And I think just quickly, the other point I was going to make is we need to be talking about this as well. And I don't think it's necessarily in terms of, wow, look at what we're doing, aren't we doing wonderful things on the environment, because there's always going to be more to do. But just to, I mean, Stuart, maybe the example you gave earlier of your catering lady actually saying we're going to reduce single-use plastics, there would have been, maybe you did this, but there would have been an opportunity to just make the point to the club members who are coming in, saw that they no longer had single use, and then say, well, this is why, or these are the reasons behind. So I don't know if you do that, and that's not sort of a challenge for you to respond to, but it just shows those opportunities when changes are made. You can actually explain to your club members and your players and your fans and the parents, this is why we've done something, and it's fairly low key, but it's just information and it's knowledge, and it just makes it normal behavior, and maybe they'll take that back home with them as well. So it's sometimes pitching the level that you communicate these things at it has the biggest impacts, because really, your club is relatively small, and I think this is a key thing for sport. Compare sport as a sector. Yes, it's huge, lots of influence, but our actual carbon footprint, compare it to almost any other sector, certainly up to the big chemical companies and your BPs and your Shells and whatever, we're relatively insignificant. But the opportunity, the 9 biggest influencers on social media are sports people. There was a study done, I don't know how they quantified this, but the influence of sport in terms of social media and interaction, it accounts for about 60% of all of the influencing. And I don't even know really what that term means, frankly, but somebody's out there quantifying these things, and sport is the biggest influencer globally. So if we just talk about these issues, it can have a massive impact.
Sorry, just to jump in there, Stuart, you might want to enter our BASIS awards. You could have mentioned that, right? So because those are exactly the kinds of examples we're looking for in there.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thank you, and thanks for that offer, Russell, of kind of supporting with resources and tools and things. That's really helpful. Thank you. Did someone put a hand up and then they went down? Sorry, I thought.
Yeah, it was me actually. I need to sign off, but let's just to say, first of all, I think it's been an interesting session. Secondly, happy to reconvene another time. Doesn't have to be every month or anything, but maybe 3 or 4 times a year. This sort of thing's really useful. And just to pick up Russell's point, yes, I think one of the things I have brought to our rugby club is tell people about the good stuff you're doing, because in the community sports enterprise, most people just rock up, play their game or drop their kids off. They don't know what goes on behind. But yeah, we got some positive publicity out of it, because for the beer cups, we designed the same sort of, they're called fan cups, I think, aren't they? You see them in a lot of sports venues, and we got a nice graphic around it with some silhouettes of males and females playing a bit of rugby, and it was quite a nice feel-good thing about it. But along the way, it was turning us into away from the single-use plastic. So yeah, always looking for an opportunity to show that we're doing the right thing. And I believe, well, yeah, one of my grandkids, 6 years old, the other day said to me, da 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 da, and that's good for the environment, Granddad. And this is exactly what's going to be coming through from the generations 2 levels down. It's just going to be part of business as usual is to be thinking about the environmental impact. Okay, that's it. I must go, but thanks very much for your time, folks. See you again.
Great, thanks, Stuart. All the best. Okay, so it sounds like there are a number of areas where clubs are able to make a difference, and the first step is probably just to raise the awareness and the understanding across the sector that is an opportunity, and it's up to clubs and individuals to take that step if they want to. There's no sort of diktat is there here. As we said, it's more about just encouragement. If there are rules, if there are regulations coming down, we'll see it from the NGBs and from Sport England and from those in authority. But actually, from what we're doing and the organisations that have been on today, there is an opportunity to influence and just start to change mindsets a little bit. Okay, I don't think there's anything else from me at this point, apart from to say thank you all for coming along. Peter, is there anything that you wanted to add? Want to say anything we haven't covered? Anyone?
No, that was very uplifting and positive discussion, and grateful to everybody. To always find new people out there banging their heads against the same wall is always a joy. So keep up the good work and keep in touch.
Yeah, great. Ellie, thank you very much for coming along, giving us that insight from Reading Football Club. Great to hear all the work that you're doing. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Russell?
Yeah, so I was just going to ask that practical question about if we can reconvene in whenever, 2 or 3 months' time, who's going to do that? Does somebody have a contact list? If it's under control and somebody has an email list of people on here. But yeah, very happy to be part of that. But who would pull that together?
So that's probably down to myself and Peter between us. We're wanting to do this from GBA's perspective. It's part of our network, kind of role anyway, and we've got the contacts, so we'll pull you all in. Mark's just saying he's feeling very guilty. Mark, sorry we couldn't get you actually on camera today, and I hope you're feeling better soon. But good idea about issuing reusable water bottles rather than just the disposables, which I know some clubs have gone over to. So some have taken that step, whether that's a PR thing or whether it was about sustainability, I don't know, but I have seen that. But you're feeling a bit guilty about going up to the NFL game. I don't think life has to stop.
No,
You've still got to enjoy yourself. Otherwise, what's the point in saving the world if there's no fun anymore?
Yeah, and I know the guys from NFL Green are over here for this match, and I believe they will be offsetting. I'm going to a presentation with them on Monday afternoon, so maybe I could report back, Mark.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you all for coming again, and we'll be in touch soon. So all the best, and yeah.
Cheers.
Thanks, Nick.
Great session, Nick. Thanks for organising.
Good to meet you all.
Cheerio. Bye.
Bye.